Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to your lesson on Quebec. So Quebec is an incredible province, incredible place to live, and incredibly complex immigration program to study for your ICCRC exam. So in this first lesson, we're going to set the foundation of our understanding of immigration and the Quebec programs and how it all can relate to your upcoming ICCRC exam. So when we think of Quebec immigration, we need to, of course, think of how this relates to your upcoming exam. Now, I know for a lot of you, you took your Immigration Practitioner Diploma program and you maybe covered Quebec just a little bit, or not at all, even for some of you. And that's fine. For your teachers in your programs, I know a lot of them now, and they care about you. They want to give you as much practical information as possible for your program because they want you to, be prepared for life as a consultant. And for a lot of people, they won't take those extra steps to become accredited by the MIFI, maybe because if you don't speak French, it can be very complex. So for your teachers, they wanted to spend more time on maybe practical areas instead of other areas such as Quebec. However, in terms of your upcoming ICCRC exam, this is a topic that will play a role in your exam. So this means that we need to, of course, work on this and make sure that, we can tackle those questions. So in terms of your exam, Quebec plays a role on the exam. Is this bad news? Well, for some of you, it might be a bit disconcerting. It is a huge topic, so it's gigantic. It's as big, really, as all of the economic programs for Canada. It's almost like a little mini federal immigration system, right? Because there are so many similarities between everything in Quebec immigration and the federal programs. However, there are, some kind of little differences in there. So that's good news, actually, because for a lot of you, when you're working on Quebec immigration, or you see a Quebec immigration question in the exam, well, if your intuition is telling you that a certain answer is the answer because you know this from maybe a federal program, that's a good start. Otherwise, of course, you have your Test Day Data Booklet in front of you. We have Quebec incredibly covered over there, and you will be able to answer those questions quickly. All right, if you're taking the seminar with us, of course, we talk about strategies for this program as well. If you're working through this video, that's great as well. Now, in terms of the big picture and thinking of your business in the future, we have actually a MIFI accredited RCIC on our team, and that's Lisette Ruiz. And we talk all the time about you, about new consultants, about strategies and tips for new consultants. And what she says and what a lot of the other MIFI accredited RCICs say is that for all of you, if you can reach that goal of course, passing the ICCRC exam, but later on becoming a MIFI accredited RCIC, they say it's worth it. Quebec immigration is incredible. There's a huge amount of people who want to come specifically to Quebec, and I think you'll see why when we take a look at some of these programs. However, for some others, getting that B2 in French can be pretty difficult. But if you can do it, what everyone says is to take those steps, become a member of the MIFI. So here are our lesson goals for this lesson here. And we're going to be very concise in this lesson. So we're going to try to move along quickly because there's a lot with Quebec immigration. Like I said, it's really as detailed as federal immigration. So it is a huge topic, but of course, what we do with all the lessons is we try to make it concise, make it understandable, and relate it all to the exam. So for a lot of you, you might have heard of Quebec immigration, or you have maybe a general understanding of it if you worked through your Immigration Practitioner Diploma. For others, if you studied here in Montreal, for example, or you took an online program, I know some other programs really cover it thoroughly. So in either case, you're going to have a good time in this lesson. And we will, again, take those next steps in covering yet another topic related to your upcoming ICCRC exam. So when we think of Quebec immigration, and we think of this as a whole in terms of immigration for Canada, they released their immigration plan in about November 2020 for 2021. And it's pretty interesting because you could see that, especially in economic programs, there's quite a lot of immigration that they're targeting for this. What they did was they took because there was a downfall, of course, because of the COVID. And what they're doing is kind of adding those numbers to 2021. So they're going to go a bit bigger in terms of immigration than usual because they want to make up for the lost numbers of 2020. So when we think of Quebec immigration, it's usually targeting French-speaking immigrants. And when we think of Quebec immigration, sometimes it looks like a PNP. It's a tiny bit different, but you can think of it in some ways as yet another PNP. But there are extra little details that we'll cover, of course, in here. And when you think of this, really, you compare those Quebec numbers to PNPs, it's almost half, really, of the PNP intake is what Quebec takes for themselves. Now, those numbers that the federal government gives for PNPs, that doesn't have Quebec in it, of course. But just to give a comparison, when we're thinking of PNPs versus Quebec, well, Quebec takes a lot of immigrants through their program. Now, for those immigrants that Quebec selects, well, a lot of them have French language skills, or they're targeting French language speaking people. So this makes perfect sense because when you think of Quebec, well, it's a French speaking province. For a lot of people here in Quebec, a lot of immigrants, they can learn French actually from the government even when they arrive. We're going to see that language requirements are really, really interesting for Quebec as well. And when you take a look at those federal programs where the federal government really has been, over the last 10 years or so, they've been really promoting Francophone immigration across Canada, not only for Quebec, but you can see that Quebec really, really targets a lot of French-speaking people in comparison to the federal programs. So when we take a look at those federal programs and their targets, well, you've got some interesting numbers as well. So especially in terms of economic immigration, you could see that, well, Quebec compares pretty well with PNPs. So PNPs all across Canada basically split 84,000 immigrants amongst themselves. Obviously, some provinces have more than others. Some provinces have more programs, etc. But those are the targets from the federal government. And Quebec really has, their target is almost 34,000. And that's a huge, huge, huge number. So if you're thinking of specializing in Quebec immigration, I mean, the numbers are there for you. Okay, so it's always important to take a step back, think of the different roles of different players in immigration as it relates to everything really. But in this case, the Quebec federal government relationship is important to understand. And when we think of our dear IRPA and regulations, well, those are, of course, influenced by domestic law, which is, of course, influenced by the Constitution. Now, when we think of the federal powers versus provincial powers, well, we've got these as they relate, these ones relate more to immigration. And you've got the shared powers, which include, of course, immigration itself. Now, that is with provinces. With Quebec, it's just a tiny little bit different. But generally speaking, Quebec immigration is very similar to, well, we'll see a lot of federal programs that are similar to Quebec. And of course, the relationship between the federal government and provincial governments in terms of immigration is very similar to Quebec as well, but there are some differences which we will discuss. So when we think of the legal framework that allows Quebec to select its own immigrants, it is from this agreement here, so the Canada-Quebec Accord. Now, we've got Section 12A-B-C, and basically all this says is that Quebec does their own selection. So Quebec can select their own immigrants, and the federal government does admissibility. And there's no overlap between the two, all right? So Quebec cannot take a look at the government decision on admissibility and say, no, we want to select this person anyways. The federal government cannot take a look at Quebec's immigration of a certain person who qualifies for a Quebec program and say, no, we won't allow this person in. except for, of course, admissibility. Now, when you dig a little bit deeper and you look at Quebec and the laws that influence Quebec immigration, well, you've got them over here. And those are implemented and enforced by the MIFI. So this is a question people ask all the time. Do you need to know all of the agreements and everything like that Canada has signed? And the answer, and this is, of course, is in the context of your ICCRC exam. Well, the answer is no. You do need to kind of know what those agreements are, generally speaking, right? So you don't need to know really in detail about every single agreement. I wouldn't spend too much time on this, but you do need to have a general idea of what everything does, really. So let's jump into the RCIC-MIFI relationship, because this is unique when we think of immigration across those provinces in Canada. So in order to represent a client who wants to immigrate through a Quebec program, an RCIC has to be registered with the MIFI. So this is an important study tip for the exam, because if this comes up in the exam, I mean, this is a pretty easy question type. We have some questions similar to this in the simulations you're working through. And it's generally, I mean, a pretty easy concept. So it's something that we want to focus on. All right, so how is Quebec different from PNPs? So we will see that there are a lot of similarities between what Quebec does and other provinces in terms of immigration. But there is a difference as well. So like I said, for RCICs, you do need to be MIFI registered. Now, what are those requirements to be MIFI registered? Well, they're here. Basically, you have to pay, of course. Your company has to be registered in Quebec as well. You do have to be, of course, an RCIC who is in good standing. And that those language requirements, I think the language requirements in a real life context, I think that's the part that's the most difficult for people. You do have to pass a Quebec immigration rules exam. So similar to the ICCRC exam, but it's about Quebec immigration. And the feedback, of course, is that that exam is easier than the ICCRC exam. All right, so when we think of those general requirements for Quebec immigration, I've got a few steps, and I wanted to bring this up because the requirements are a little bit different from regular PMPs. So in terms of the procedures, that's what we'll discuss first here, but we're going to work through those 5 steps because they each teach us something unique about Quebec immigration and something unique that could play a role on the exam, of course, but even speaking a bit more broadly, could play a role in your life as a consultant. So let's talk about the overall general immigration process for Quebec. And like I said, we're going to try to keep this really concise for you. There's a million little tiny details about Quebec immigration, but you don't have a million hours. So we'll discuss what's important, generally speaking, in terms of the exam, and in terms of, well, understanding the general process for immigration. So the immigration process is a little bit different from the process for a person who is coming to Quebec, temporarily. Now, in this one here, the person would, of course, first qualify for a program. I mean, that's the way it works. It's for everything, really. You would never take a client who doesn't qualify and apply like that. They do use the ARIMA portal. So you might think of, in trying to find similarities between federal programs and Quebec programs, you might think of the ARIMA as somewhat similar to the express entry system, somewhat. With the CSQ, that is the certificate that a person obtains that's used for the PR application. So this is something different from other provinces. And then, of course, the person would apply to the IRCC for permanent residency. Now, the federal government would then do the admissibility types of requirements. The checklist, actually, for this type of immigration is the same as PNPs. So there are, of course, a lot of similarities in this. Now, for the study process for Quebec, or work process for temporary workers who are going to Quebec, you still have these 2 players here. And it's probably, you might think it's four players really, because there's you, the RCIC, there's the client, there's the MIFI, and there's the IRCC. So with this one here, the person would again likely apply through the ARIMA portal. That's for students. For workers, it's a little bit different, but the employers use the ARIMA portal for finding workers. Now, the person would obtain a CAQ. So in English, it's a Quebec Acceptance Certificate. You might see it in some of the material or in the exam as un certificat de sélection du Québec, and it means the same thing. So don't worry about that too much. And then, of course, the person applies to the IRCC with that CAQ for the study permit or work permit. And then it's really the usual process for the study permit or work permit after that with the IRCC. And they can do it online, just like well, it is the regular process at that point, right? Where it will go to a visa office if the person's outside of Canada, or online if the person is in Canada already. So the ARIMA is the portal that's used. If you ever see this in an exam context, I don't think you really will, but just for your general information, it's the portal. It's similar to Express Entry, where, well, you have an online system basically to take those steps for immigration. For permanent residency programs that go through Quebec, you can see it works with the Skilled Worker Program, the PEC, which we'll see later on. For students, they would submit their documents through the portal as well. For representatives who are MIFI accredited, you have kind of a portal for yourself too, the client portal that you can log into and use as well. And of course, well, similar to Job Bank, I guess, employers can use this portal to find workers to hire. So those are the general procedures for Quebec immigration. Now, beyond this, there's more. I mean, there's general procedures, which we looked at for number 1, and there's requirements, basically, which will be what we'll look at for 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the general requirements. There are specific requirements for each individual program, just as any other program for immigration. All right, so one of those requirements that is somewhat universal across the PR programs for Quebec is that a person has to pass an exam. And the exam is basically on Quebec immigration, about, not Quebec immigration really, but Quebec values. We'll look at an example in the next slide here, but these are the steps for this really. The MIFI will email the person, and it's an online exam. So the person can take the exam, takes 3 hours, it has 20 questions, which seems so easy for all of you because you're getting ready for 140 questions in 3 hours. They need a 15 out of 20 in order to move on to those next steps of their PR application. So the accompanying family of the person has to pass this exam as well. They get a guide, basically, and they study and pass this exam. Now, theoretically, if the person cannot pass the exam after 2 times, well, they would take a course, which is in person in Quebec, or it might be online now because of COVID. All right, so when we're thinking of this exam, it might seem kind of easy for you actually with this, because, well, you're getting ready for a very complex exam. But for this one here, I've never heard, asked Lizette about this, if she's ever even heard of someone who failed this exam and that led to them not being able to immigrate through Quebec. And she said no. And she's worked with helping, it must be hundreds now, of people who immigrated to Quebec. So I think that shows you kind of in a practical sense what happens. But of course, theoretically, if a person cannot pass the exam, they cannot immigrate to Quebec, despite, of course, having all of those other requirements. So if you look at the sample questions here, I mean, they're pretty straightforward. If for clients who don't read the manual, I think it can be a little bit difficult. So again, I don't think this will be on the exam, but it is, of course, important to know those general requirements for Quebec immigration, and we're doing this kind of quickly as well as we progress through the lesson here. Okay, so the next topic is the French language requirements. Now, this is something pretty interesting actually, because generally speaking, for those federal programs, the language requirements are, pretty universal. And basically you connect the program with the language score from the exam itself, connect that with CLB, and you're good, right? Quebec's a little bit different. So Quebec has different exams that are accepted, that aren't accepted for federal programs. Their scoring system is a little tiny bit different as well. And we will discuss this just because, again, if this comes up on the exam, perfect. I want you to really be sure that this wouldn't be an issue for you. So just in terms of immigration programs and those language requirements, some of these Quebec programs actually only have a speaking and listening requirement. So it's very, very, very interesting, very approachable, I think, for clients. And for all of you, if you see something, it's all in the book, of course, in the Test Day Data Booklet, but if you see something kind of related to that, don't be surprised. It's not a mistake or anything like that. It's just the fact that the Quebec government has different language requirements than other provinces and other programs. So when we think of exams in federal terms, so every single federal economic program has a language requirement, right? Just like every PNP. Now those language requirements are the result of 4 language exams. So we've talked about this quite a bit. Of course, IELTS, CELPIP, TEF, and TCF. Now for Quebec, it's a little bit different. So Quebec accepts quite a variety of, I wouldn't call them different exams really, but they are kind of different forms of those exams. So for example, le TEF versus le TEFAC. Basically, the French is just more sort of Quebec oriented for le TEFAC. Now IELTS General is accepted as well, just like all the other programs. TCF is accepted just like all the other programs. TCF Quebec is a little bit different, and that's accepted as well for Quebec. And the DELF and the DELF. Now, theoretically, the DELF and the DELF, we'll talk about that just a little bit. And again, you won't really see this in real life. So in talking to MIFI accredited RCICs, a lot of them said that they've never seen DELF results or DELF results. And they said that they see, of course, a lot of TEF and TIFAC. So different language exams are used. Also, different ways of referring to language results are used as well. So on the MIFI website or not really in exam questions, but just to let you know this, just in case it ever comes up really, they do have a different way of saying reading, listening, etc., right? So the big difference is in the last one, oral comprehension refers to listening, and written comprehension refers to reading. So just a couple of different terms used by the MIFI that mean basically the same thing as that we're used to. Okay, so the MIFI uses a bit of a different system. There's not that much of a difference actually with this, but just in case it comes up in an exam context, this is something quick to know. And I'll run through this little section here pretty quickly because, you know me, I'm an exam guy and I would love to talk about language exams forever, but we have to move on with this topic, right? So anyways, their system is called the Échelle québécoise de niveau de compétence. And it reminds, if you've seen it before, the Common European Framework, well, it's somewhat similar to that. Now this is used for MIFI purposes, and it is used for French language exams. So even though the IELTS is used for MIFI purposes, well, the IELTS does not go on this system. So when you think of the Common European Framework, that is when you see something that says A1 to C2. A1 is basic, C2 is expert level, and well, it corresponds with the Échelle québécoise in most ways. And the Échelle québécoise runs from 1 through 12, similar to the CLB. So we know the CLB quite a bit. It is important to, I think, just have a kind of a quick idea of the other ones as well, right? The EQ and CEFR. So a lot of people make this, I don't want to call it a mistake, but it is a slight difference in that they often think that a CLB7 is a B2, and it is, except there's a little bit of a tiny difference in there, right? So when you take a look at the CLB score as it refers to the TEF, well, we can see that, speaking just as an example, is 310 to 348 as the score. Well, the B2 level in the CEFR, which also refers to a level 7, 8 in the Échelle Québécoise, is 271 to 348. So there's a small little difference in scores over there. Is this important for the exam? I don't really know. I mean, maybe. Is this important just to make sure that we understand what's being referred to when we have somebody who says B2, C1, C2, etc.? Yes. So when we refer to these language scores in your material in the exam, is there likely to be a question that says something like John got a 227 in his TEF speaking? What does that refer to in the Common European Framework or the Échelle Québécoise? No. However, just so that you're not kind of confused with the grid that we're using in your Test Day Data Booklet, well, that's what we're referring to over here. So it's basically kind of categorizing B2 with CLB with the language exam itself, even though CLB will not be used in the French exams for Quebec. However, CLB might be used to refer to IELTS for Quebec immigration. The DELF and the DALF, even though you probably will never see this in real life, well, a question might refer to someone as obtaining a B2 in DELF. Now, when a person gets higher than that in that diploma, well, then it's called the DALF. It's technically, I guess, a different diploma. So again, just something that I wanted to go over in 1 little minute, just to make sure that there's no confusion for this when we are moving on into talk about Quebec's economic programs. All right, so let's move on to talk about financial self-sufficiency and proof of funds. Now, this is a little bit different from the federal numbers, and this might be a reason, it's another sort of bonus for people when they're thinking of moving to Quebec versus Canada, because these numbers are quite a bit lower actually than what you would need to prove to the federal government in terms of proof of funds. So these are the numbers for this year, and it's all in the Test Day Data Booklet. So when you have a question like this, you should be pretty happy. A question that refers to maybe a couple and they have 1 kid, how much money do they need to prove to the Quebec government? Perfect. You can be sure to answer that one accurately if you're using the material. So again, it's a good question to get. All right, and the last one is, well, these are the regular kind of requirements that are, I mean, the exact same really with PNPs, but we'll just take a very quick look at this once more. So the intent to live in Quebec. Now, this is always a really key piece of the requirements for everything really. Well, for PMPs, of course, in localized immigration. So when we think of the RNIP, when we think of AIPP, all these localized immigration programs, well, that intention is the key. So we have a whole lesson on this. Be sure to work through this. It would be the same ideas exactly as Quebec. And if you, again, have a good understanding of intent, well, I think for Quebec programs, when we refer to Quebec programs, if you have a good understanding of intent, you have a good understanding of language exams, I mean, you're halfway there pretty much. Other than that, it'll be sort of little details that we'll take a look at later on. Okay, the final little piece of the puzzle that I wanted to discuss today has to do after a application is refused, because we saw that Quebec immigration is a little bit different from other programs, and those recourses really for when an application is refused are slightly different as well. So these will remind you, of course, of a judicial review and an appeal, but the organization that does it is different, of course. Now, for an administrative review is what it's called in Quebec, and this is done by the MIFI. For an appeal, this is done by the Tribunal Administratif, so the TAC. The reason why, of course, is similar to what we've seen with judicial review versus appeals, right? And who can do this, though, is a little bit different in here, okay? So for an appeal, well, you have people who had their family class application rejected. Who can file for an administrative review? Well, it's people who fall under these programs. So it's mostly, we've got the economic programs, of course. Humanitarian collective sponsorship refers to kind of sponsored refugees and that type of thing. And students, basically, who are rejected. Of course, days, that's something very important to know as well. And here's the timelines, really, that a person needs to file for administrative review or appeal. And that is, of course, 90 days versus 60 days. All right, well, thank you for taking this journey with me through Quebec immigration. The reason for this lesson was to, of course, give us a foundation, really, to work with as we dig a little bit deeper into this program. All right, good work, everybody. I'll see you in the next lesson.